One issue is brought up continually within American politics, specifically on the right, and that's the issue of illegal immigration into this country and the crisis at the southern border.
CBP is facing an unprecedented humanitarian and border security crisis all along our southwest border.
A little earlier, quote, Mexico is doing nothing to help stop the flow of illegal immigrants to our country. They're all talk and no action. Likewise, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador have taken our money for years and do nothing. The Dems don't care. Such bad laws may close the southern border.
He'll be laying out the facts to the American people of what is a genuine humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart, and a crisis of the soul.
And I want to argue here that this is a manufactured crisis that isn't an actual threat to Americans, specifically American workers, but rather a political tool leveraged in order to gain power at the expense of the U.S., its economy, and at the expense of low-skilled workers who believe that they are voting in their own interest when they vote against immigrants. So let's go ahead and look at the history of immigration into this country and then talk about this modern supposed crisis at the southern border. Relatively unrestricted immigration to the United States between the 1830s and 1930s built the U.S. into the world superpower that it is today. In the 1830s, mass immigration from Irish, German, and English workers provided the skilled and unskilled labor necessary to build up manufacturing areas in urban centers, and it allowed the U.S. to expand into the world-leading industrial power. By the time immigration limits began to take effect within the 1920s, 43% of global economic output was from the United States. And in the absence of a sizable and motivated immigrant labor force, the economy could never have expanded in the way that it did between the 1830s and 1930s. And that's because immigration contributed to approximately 16 to 22% of the national economic output just in 4 decades between 1870 and 1910. So we can see that the U.S. was utilizing immigration as a source of labor in order to build the nation and build up industry and build up the economic status that we had in the world, and allow us to become this wealthy nation where now we can provide extremely high standards of living to everyone within this country. And so one of the reasons that immigrants were able to help everybody within the nation is that they raised the per capita income of native residents. And this was because the considerably higher proportion of these immigrants who were immigrating to the United States from areas within Europe in massive amounts were working a much higher proportion than native-born people. And so they increased the per capita output of goods and services within the country, even though they were less skilled. And as we're going to look at later, expanded the number of jobs within the country, expanded the amount of opportunity in the country, and helped everyone from low skilled to skilled workers. This period of a lot of expansion because of immigration, however, was not met without backlash, and we can look toward the Chinese Exclusion Act for this, where racist sentiments were used by politicians in order to turn workers against each other and galvanize the white majority within the country against a scapegoated minority, and by turning their frustration toward these minorities rather than toward political power structures, ultimately undermining the very workers who were voting against their own interests and the American economy at large. So we can look toward the Transcontinental Railroad, which was built in 1869 and linked America's east to west. And this was a massive economic benefit to the United States. And it was extremely difficult. Over 6 years, 10,000 workers built these tracks in treacherous conditions, with 80% of the laborers being migrants from China. And it led to rapid economic growth and expansion within the United States by creating a very easy trade route throughout the U.S. And so, however, this was met with backlash, and white settlers were led to believe that these Chinese migrants were driving their wages down and threatening the independence and self-sufficiency of the white workers. They were told that these low-skilled laborers were taking their jobs and were limiting their opportunities, when in reality we can see from just the building of this track and the utilization of labor that without these Chinese migrants, millions of jobs within the United States would have never occurred. And even though the Chinese within our country at the time only accounted for 0.002% of the population, Congress passed an exclusion in the veil with thinly veiled idea of maintaining racial purity within the United States after Chinese labor was used in order to build this massively economically beneficial railroad. And so we can then look toward what the impact of these racially motivated laws were within the United States. In a document written at the time about the impact of this, it says that the passage of the exclusion laws operated as a cone over a lighted candle. Chinese residents in California withdrew from industry, reduced their properties to coin, and with it returned to China, scrambling out of a country which they deemed inhospitable and unsafe. Business dried up. Trade with China, which had been advancing at a rate of 1 million a year, fell off 7 millions in 2 years. America has cut herself away from a nation which, by simple justice and fairness of treatment, she might mold to her own advantage. This cutting off has been done and now being done in blind ignorance under the erroneous belief that it is benefiting the people it is most seriously harming. So this created a trickle down in American history where economic growth that we could have potentially had through this beneficial trade relationship, through the benefit of these workers coming over from China and filling valuable low-skilled labor jobs and filling and acting as an economic resource in order to expand our economic growth, as we have historically done in the past within the United States, was all wiped away simply because racism was used by politicians to trick voters in voting against their own interests. And this is a trend that we see time and time again in American history, and which we are seeing today happen under the Trump administration. So the U.S. was still, despite the Chinese Exclusion Act and other racist policies such as this, benefiting from relatively mass immigration into the country, but the national origins quota system ended this in 1921 and led to strict numerical limits on immigration coming into the United States, and was racist in its policy that it favored immigrants coming from northwestern Europe. And looking at some of the quotes from people who helped pass these policies, we can see echoes of our current political situation. So, reading one quote from one of the legislators who helped pass this bill: "The character of immigration has changed, and newcomers are imbued with lawless, resentful sentiments of anarchy and collectivism. They arrive to find their hopes too high, the land almost gone, and themselves driven to drown into the cities and struggle for a living. Then anarchy becomes rife among them." So that's from Representative Albert Johnson, who helped write this. And then another person at the time who was pinnacle in getting this passed said that "I would build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, against the admission of a single one of those southern Europeans who never thought the thoughts or spoke the language of a democracy in their lives." And that's from George Governor Clifford Walker at a Ku Klux Klan rally, which sounds oddly familiar to some politician in modern day, though I can't put my finger on it. And then we can even go to this quote stating that the vast majority of the people that move illegally into the United States are not bad people. They're not criminals. Some of them are not, but they're also not people that would easily assimilate into the United States, into our modern society. They're overwhelmingly rural people in the countries they come from. 4th, 5th, 6th grade educations are kind of the norm. They don't speak English. Obviously, that's a big thing. They don't speak English. They don't integrate well. They don't have skills. They're not bad people. They're coming here for a reason, and I sympathize with that reason, but the laws are laws. And that's actually from, oh shoot, I don't know how that got in there. That's not from the right time period. That's from Kelly from the White House Chief of Staff in 2018. But yeah, I guess you get the general idea from the quotes at that time. And so this policy was passed in order to once again appeal to white workers within America and turn them against other laborers and turn their potential anxiety or political anxiety against themselves. But the white working class people who these policies were targeted at and galvanizing were the ones hurt most by its implementation. So in one study done, they found that natives living in areas most affected by the quota system implemented were actually pushed into lower wage jobs. And for the average affected area, native workers experienced a 2% decline in earnings after the quota system was implemented. Why? Because like we talked about before, when you decrease the amount of labor that areas are able to utilize, you decrease the productive output potential and thus decrease the amount of job opportunities. And you also decrease the number of people able to utilize these consumer goods, able to buy homes, able to buy goods within that local community, and thus you decrease the overall size of the economy, and that leads to tangible, in this case, a 2% decline in earnings when this quota system was implemented. And the Brookings Institute explains that although many are concerned that immigrants compete against Americans for jobs, the most recent economic evidence suggests that on average, immigrant workers increase the opportunities and incomes for Americans because they fill jobs that Americans are unwilling to work and allow U.S.-born farmers and contractors and craftsmen to expand agricultural production and do stuff like build homes and expand employment possibilities and income for U.S. workers. And that another way in which they help the U.S. workers is that the businesses adjust to new immigrants by opening stores, restaurants, and production facilities to take advantage of the added supply of workers. More workers translates into more businesses, and that's why we see these tangible declines in people's earnings whenever we're doing these restrictive racist policies, and that was the tangible 2% decline in earnings. And estimates from opposite ends of the academic literature arrive at the same conclusion and point to small but positive wage gains between 0.1 and 0.6% for American workers whenever immigration is allowed to flow into these communities unabided by racist policies that are made to appeal to a voting base that are ultimately hurt by these policies' implementation. And as a Yale Law and Policy Review states, this is what we saw happen when the national origins quota system was implemented, because among the adverse initial effects of limiting inflow from Eastern and Southern Europeans, for example, was a reduction in the demand for housing and consumer goods in urban areas where most of these immigrants settled. And so you see a contraction in the economy, and this actually was precipitating the Great Depression, whose impact was worsened because of these policies, because the income generated by having these immigrants within the country and the labor generated and the consumer output and productivity and consumption that would have happened if these immigrants were in the economy would have stimulated the demand for housing and consumer goods and led to the Great Depression not being as bad as it was according to this analysis by Yale. So we can see that everyone within the U.S. economy, from low-skilled workers to highly skilled workers to corporate owners to businesses, were impacted in a negative way. Why? Because politicians utilized racism, utilized scapegoating certain immigrant groups to gain political power at the expense of the American people. It's not a surprise then that the end of the national origins quota system led to massive economic growth within the United States, and surprisingly a lot of economic growth happening within the Asian American communities, created within totaling billions in new revenue generated in entrepreneurship. And it's a lot of economics that we don't need to go through, but one of the interesting side effects of this was the creation of a lot of illegal immigration into the country because of push and pull factors occurring at the time. And so when looking at the impacts of illegal immigration into America, we don't see this like massive negative of illegal immigrants coming in. In fact, illegal immigration was linked to less unemployment, a slow in the decline of manufacturing jobs because the illegal immigrants were essentially able to provide a labor pool large enough to sustain some manufacturing jobs within the United States past the point in time when they would have stopped becoming profitable. So it allowed us to be much more competitive as a country and it also contributed a lot to the creation of new jobs through stimulation within the economy. So the same principles we talked about with general immigration before applied to this new wave of illegal immigration we saw coming in the South, and actual economic benefits being reaped out of this. And we're going to get into some specific numbers later, but just looking at the just looking at a few really quickly, because of the payment into local, state and local taxes, and because of the job growth created by illegal immigration. For example, if Texas were to deport all of our illegal immigrants that we have accumulated since this kind of push-pull factor started happening at the end of the national origins quota, we would lose $400 million in state revenue and 2.3% of jobs in the state because of the loss of economic stimulus of illegal immigration. A state like Arizona, another one with a large population of illegal immigrants, would lose $11.7 billion in gross state profit over 140,000 jobs in all undocumented, if all undocumented immigrants were to leave. So we see like massive economic benefit coming from push-pull factors, from immigrants filling labor needs within our country and leaving economic hardship in order to fill that. So then, to finally contextualize this discussion within history and then get to the status quo, let's look at the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act passed by Congress that led to the legalization of 2.7 million illegal immigrants who were granted a pathway to citizenship and were able to receive it, and how then this impacted the economy. The Department of Labor at the time sponsored 2 studies which looked at what the effect of this law was, and found that those immigrants made substantial wage gains, and at 3 years after legalization, many of them obtaining even more jobs and growing the economy. This is going to be really important in the economic discussion that we're about to get into. But so let's look at the current crisis at the border, and let's look at the arguments that conservatives are making to try to say that we need to tackle this, and why it actually is a non-issue and simply, as we have looked at historically, a political tool to leverage power, not to help the American worker. So are illegal immigrants hurting the economy?
Provide an update to the American people regarding the crisis on our southern border, and crisis it is. Illegal immigration affects the lives of all Americans. Illegal immigration hurts American workers.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. One of the most striking features of the debate over immigration in America is the fact that it's not much of a debate. You'll notice the failure, indeed the refusal, of our elites to grapple with what exactly it means to allow millions of low-skilled workers from around the world to move here.
Well, we currently have a jobs gap within the United States. 6 million jobs were vacant in mid-2018, and many employers trying to fill positions have exhausted sources for U.S. workers. So we need more workers within this country to fill the job gap and to grow the economy. We don't have a surplus of labor, we have a shortage, and these illegal immigrants are labor that we can utilize within our economy to grow. And so when we're looking then at the cost that illegal immigrants would have on society, let's look toward the study which shows that academic research indicates that the presence of immigrant workers in the labor market has expanded the U.S. economy by an estimated 11%, representing an increase equivalent to $2 trillion of the GDP in 2016. At the same time, the presence of unauthorized workers contributes disproportionately to reduced prices, particularly those in service. U.S.-born consumers so often rely upon, including childcare, food preparation, housekeeping, landscaping, gardening, and construction. So not only did they grow the economy by $2 trillion and can grow much further, as evidenced by the jobs gap that we have currently, but also they drive down the prices of services that are utilized by the American consumer, increasing the purchasing power of Native American workers currently. So we're not seeing this massive economic harm. But even going further than that, so an argument that's often brought up is like that illegal immigrants are utilizing social services in a disproportionate amount, and this is leading to a net drain in the economy.
But facts still matter, and tonight we have some. A new study by the Federation for American Immigration Reform finds that this country's approximately 11 million illegal immigrants cost taxpayers about $135 billion per year in medical, education, and law enforcement expenses. Now, there's an offset to this: taxes. And yet, according to the study, these illegal immigrants pay only about $19 billion a year in taxes. That leaves a deficit, which you pay, of $116 billion.
And while, yes, the scholarly evidence shows that in the status quo, first-generation illegal immigrants do have something of a net negative impact as far as the social services that they're taking versus the ones that they're giving, this is a really short-term way to look at it, because we have to look at what the impact of second and third generation will be in the long term, or whether or not this balances out that net impact. And to illustrate, while research approaches vary, the experts who authorized this study found that the cost of first-generation immigrants and their dependents to state and local budgets during the period between 2011 and 2013 was approximately $1,600 per family. So there was a cost. However, the opposite was true of immigrants second and third generations, who created a net positive of about $1,700 and $1,300 each, respectively, to state and local budgets in the same time frame. And these numbers mean that first-generation immigrant adults and their dependents were estimated to cost a total of $57.4 billion annually at time, while second and third-generation offspring immigrants added $30.5 billion and $223.8 billion respectively. And even short-term fiscal costs in the form of expenditures like K-12 public education for those immigrants can be viewed as an investment. It could drive higher wages in the future, since later in the life cycle, working and tax-paying adults typically become net contributors to public finances. So far be it from policy to try to deport these people. Rather, we should integrate them into society and allow them to utilize social services to the fullest and provide paths to citizenship so they become net benefits to the economy and fill this jobs gap currently within the United States. And in fact, these welfare programs that are supposedly a drain on the economy are being underutilized by illegal immigrants, because where they are eligible, even though they're ineligible for most U.S. welfare programs, where they are eligible, they're underutilized because of a chilling effect where the illegal immigrants will be afraid to use these services. And as we saw with the last immigration reform I talked about, whenever they did provide a pathway to citizenship, we saw the wages being earned increase dramatically, and therefore, as this study shows, the second and third generation immigrants become net contributors to society. And so this is an all contrasted with the idea of building a wall, the idea of keeping out these unauthorized immigrants, and the actual cost that that would have to society. A research paper published by Stanford University shows that at a construction cost of approximately $7 per person, which would be a $4 billion border wall in the United States, they estimated that the expansion harmed Mexican workers and high-skilled U.S. workers and benefited low-skilled workers in the U.S. who average achieved welfare gains equivalent to an increase of $0.28 per year, 28 cents per year. So at the cost of $7 in taxes, they would gain 28 cents. So even low-skilled workers who might have less competition, if you're looking at it in like a very narrow lens, even they would not benefit from having a border wall and having the cost to keep out illegal immigrants. And this is because it's extremely costly. For when we can look toward the Secure Fence Act passed under the Obama administration, who advocated for some degree of increased border security, that this act declined GDP by $30,000 for every illegal immigrant stop. That the cost of stopping illegal immigrants, and let alone the cost of deporting illegal immigrants, is much, much more than the cost of integrating them within society and making net contributors out of second and third generation immigrants to this country. And that driven primarily by a decline in relative scarcity of high school labor, the average high school U.S. worker was also harmed in an amount equivalent to a decline in annual income of $2.73 whenever this Secure Fence Act was put in place. And so whenever you see people making the argument that, like, oh, we need to keep out illegal immigrants because they're a cost to society, or there's like an economic cost. No, the economic cost isn't keeping them out. The economic benefit comes from pathways to citizenships, comes from integration into society, and comes from allowing them to fill the jobs gap within the United States and grow GDP in tangible ways. If we want to help workers, both low and high skilled, we will allow these people to utilize U.S. services, increase consumer demand within this country, grow businesses, grow jobs, and as historical trends have shown, grow U.S. prosperity overall for everyone. So what reason then, if not economics, could we have for keeping out illegal immigrants, aside from it being a political tool utilized by the right in order to trick voters and turn workers against each other and in order to pull the hood over Americans and decrease economic growth overall simply because of selfish reasons? What reason could we think of? Is it because illegal immigrants are committing more crime?
Reasons would justify building a wall?
Yes.
Crime. Yeah. Crime. Did I already say crime is reason one? I don't know. I got lost in my own train of thought.
13.
Countries with extremely high crime, and you take a scoop of people and throw them into your country, you're going to get probably
Higher
some of that crime over. So you
Yeah.
have to be discriminatory.
Yeah,
They've
you
got
absolutely do.
I want to make strong borders, want to get rid of any crime because of the borders, of which there's a lot.
Well, no. Illegal immigrants are underrepresented in crime. We can look toward data from the Cato Institute that shows that illegal immigrant incarceration rates are about half those of native-born Americans, but that additionally, incarceration rates for young illegal immigrants brought here as children are much lower than those of native-born Americans. So across the board, illegal immigrants are committing less crimes. And then we can look toward Texas specifically, because Texas is probably one of the hardest states in enforcing laws surrounding illegal immigration. And so if you would think that out of any of the states, Texas would be the best example of whether or not these illegal immigrants are committing crimes at a higher rate than native-born ones. But even within Texas, data shows that illegal immigrant conviction rates are about half those of native-born Americans, and that you see the criminal conviction rates for legal immigrants are the lowest of all. And so not only are illegal immigrants and immigrants making up a much less proportion, but even in the strictest enforcement, they do. So it's very clear that this is not a reality that America faces, that illegal immigrants are not making us more unsafe, and that this is just a political ploy in order to race bait Americans. But then you can even look toward a study that showed that in an attempt to address the gap, they combined newly developed estimates of unauthorized population with multiple data sources to capture the criminal, socioeconomic, and demographic content of all 50 states. And the results from fixed effect regression models revealed that undocumented immigration does not increase violence, but rather the relationship between undocumented immigration and violence crime is generally negative, although not significant in all specifications. So far from it increasing violence, it even decreased it in some instances. So you're not seeing this idea bearing forth of more crime coming out of illegal immigration. If anything, you see a decrease in crime, but at the very least it's a wash, with them making up a disproportionately small amount of incarceration. So clearly this idea continually put forth over and over and over again by everyone from the President of the United States to local congressmen and local representatives, that illegal immigrants are committing crime is not true and is simply a political tool and should not continue fooling American voters, especially in this upcoming election after we saw working class Americans vote against their own interests, vote for Trump. So if it's not economics, and if it's not crime, then what possible reason could be left? Is it drugs? Are they bringing drugs over the border?
Here, roughly 400 people died of drug overdoses. A stunning figure. 48% of people in New Hampshire know someone who's abused heroin in the last 5 years. Among adults under 35, it's 60%. Nearly 2/3 know someone who's abused heroin. It is an absolute tragedy, and one of the things that is fueling the tragedy is our open border.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. It's going to get built, folks. Just in case anybody has any question, the wall's going to get built, and the wall is going to stop drugs.
Well, you may have already guessed what I'm going to say, but the answer is no. First of all, increased undocumented immigration into the United States was significantly associated with reductions in drug arrests, drug overdose deaths, and DUI arrests, net of other factors. There was no significant relationship between increased undocumented immigration and DUI deaths. So when we're looking at whether or not more drugs are being brought in, when you have increases in illegal immigration or increase in illegal immigrants within an area, you see that that is not true and that they are not stop bringing in drugs. So that statement is completely false on its head. But even going further than that, the current issue being pushed is we should secure the border, and that we need to secure it with a wall or a fence or something over these like vast stretches of land. And so then you would think that that would somehow be stopping drugs if they were trying to address an actual problem and not just use this as a political tool. But in reality, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection statistics show that 90% of heroin seized along the border, 88% of cocaine, 87% of methamphetamine, and 80% of fentanyl in the first 11 months of the 2018 fiscal year was caught trying to be smuggled in illegal crossing points. So it's not coming in by illegal immigrants. It's not coming in over these stretches of land that politicians are saying we need to cover with the border. They're coming in through legal crossing points. And so clearly, this is not something that Republicans are trying to solve. This is not an issue that they care about. If they cared about it, they wouldn't have waged a war on drugs that devastated not only America, but also led to massive increases of cartels in Mexico. They would have tried to address this actual issue, but rather, they are simply using this, again, as a political tool in order to gain power and in order, by proxy, hurt the American voter. So taking in the history of immigration to this country and illegal immigration, and looking at the studies done on it in the status quo, we can see that this is not a crisis at the border. This is not a crisis of security. This is, if anything, a crisis of racism and a crisis of not integrating these people into society, because that is how you actually start to solve issues. That is how you make the U.S. economy better. Hopefully, Americans can begin to wake up to this notion and begin to see past the surface level of rhetoric that doesn't get challenged nearly enough within today's media. Because American workers have been sold a lie that their enemy is their fellow workers, and a lie that the way to make America great again is to forget everything that made it great in the first place and to scapegoat groups of marginalized people rather than seeing what we can actually do to help everybody.